This is not a podcast episode that I had planned to include in the month-long series about boundaries, but I want to talk about boundaries around sexual integrity in your marriage and when lines get crossed. Bruce Abbott, certified professional coach, founder of SecureHusband.com, and welcome back to the Secure Husband podcast. All month long, I've been talking about boundaries. I talked about why they're important. We talked about boundaries around sex and a sexless marriage, around criticism, around respect. But I want to touch on something that is starting to pop up in some of the guys that I am working with. This is about setting boundaries when certain lines get crossed in your marriage. Over the last couple of months, I've had coaching clients whose wives want sexual experiences outside the marriage. They're having questionable emotional relationships with coworkers, private messaging with other men online. Some of them wanting to create sexually explicit online content like OnlyFans accounts. I've had one who's wanted to open the marriage. And also I've had one where there is threats of emotional affairs that are happening. I want to address this, and I want to address how to set a boundary around all of this. This is something that is really, really tough because when I talk to these guys and I say, okay, if this was something you knew on the second date was going to be involved in your marriage, would there have been a third date? If you had a crystal ball, and if I had said you will have a wife that will send any appropriate texts to a coworker or will want to launch an OnlyFans account, would there have been a third date? And almost every single one of them, no, absolutely not. Once we obviously get into the marriage, there's a lot more at stake. And so what I'm talking about here is not necessarily controlling your partner's sexuality per se, but I'm talking about setting boundaries that protect the integrity of the marriage. Well, actually, it's setting boundaries that protect your self-respect as a man, but it works within the integrity of a marriage. Because the men that I work with, they're finding themselves in these situations and they are confused and they're hurt, shocked. They don't even really understand how to respond. You see a lot of this if you ever visit the Reddit subforums, the dead bedrooms, sexless marriage. You see a lot of this. And from the outside, you look and you're like, why are you tolerating that? Why are you still in that relationship? What is going on? Have you really self-abandoned yourself? And I don't say this to shame or blame or guilt or have some sort of a moral pillar that I'm standing on. But what I am saying is that when you are inside of that situation and you are a father with children and you have a home and you have assets, it does make things quite a bit more complicated. I get that. Guys are usually left stunned, wanting to know, okay, what do I do about this? What I've also noticed is men who lean anxious often tolerate these situations a whole lot longer than they should. So you have to understand the dance between insecurity and childhood wounds and healthy boundaries, what sexual integrity actually means in your marriage. And really, it's deciding what's acceptable to you and what's not. That's what it really comes down to. Because that moment that sexual boundaries inside a marriage, when they become unclear, the whole dynamic changes. Men, for whatever reason, they have a hunch. They've got a gut feeling. There's something in their intuition that tells them something is not right. Now, an asterisk to that, there are many really anxious, preoccupied men who live in that state constantly. And I do know many women who swear up and down, they're like, I haven't done any of this stuff, but he thinks I'm cheating. He thinks I'm flirting with coworkers. He thinks I'm doing all these things, and I'm honest to God not doing that. Sometimes the jealousy and the false narrative in an overly anxious husband will, and it goes both ways. It goes both partners. I will make that very clear. This is not just a male thing, but this podcast is for men. So we're approaching it from this side. But what happens in these cases is sometimes the overly anxious man creates the false narrative. But what I'm talking about men who may not necessarily live in that constant anxious state, but something made them feel that something wasn't right, and they ended up with proof. Now, I am not going to sit here and debate invasion of privacy. I'm not going to debate on what it means to go through somebody's phone. I'm not going to debate what it means to go through somebody's emails. That's for a whole nother podcast. That's a whole nother issue. But what I'm talking about is when you do find out, however you find out and you have proof. And the reason that boundaries are going to be important is because what's going to happen is almost guaranteed your invasion of privacy of their phone or their email or whatever will become the issue, not the infidelity or the inappropriate behavior. I just want to make that very, very clear because the first comments I guarantee are going to be, well, he shouldn't have been snooping through her phone. And there's a debate about that. But what I'm saying is something here caused you had a hunch. With that aside, you now have proof. Now what? Some guys are going to get very angry and explode. But what I'm finding a lot is some guys will actually, they don't want to come off as jealous or controlling. They don't want to appear insecure, especially if they've been really working on all of this. And so what they do is they hesitate to speak up when they have found out that something crosses a line. It's like they sweep it under the rug. I have talked to guys who have continued in a relationship for 20, 30 years where they found out, had concrete proof that their wife was having an affair and never said a word about it. And the thing is they think about it every single day for years. So what happens is you start to ignore little things. And again, not all men will do this. Some men will completely explode in a fit of rage. I'm talking about the men who sit in it and tolerate it. And this is the part that's really, really concerning me, is tolerating when your partner crosses a line. I had one guy talking about how he knows that his wife, when she's sending texts at 10:30 at night, he knows who she's texting. He knows what she's probably saying, but he doesn't do anything about it. He doesn't say anything about it because he's afraid. There is fear. He fears his wife being angry. He fears the wife's blowback. These situations are hard because what happens usually is any time that he has confronted his wife about something, she comes back and she says, "You're just overreacting. You're just being insecure. You're being jealous." But that just kicks his anxious nervous system into overdrive. That's why, and you're going to hear me say it 50 jillion times in this episode, nervous system regulation is key to all of this because you're going to have to stay grounded in some of these tough conversations. But that anxiety takes over. And that's where you start questioning yourself and you start to see if you can maybe be open-minded and understanding. Maybe I'm misreading things. Maybe I'm imagining things. But inside, something feels off. And if you've seen proof, sometimes you got to go with your gut. Your intuition often recognizes these boundary validations before you consciously want to admit them. You have to go with your gut feeling. And it's hard now. I mean, think about what we have in the world. I mean, just think about the last decade or so. We have private messaging. We have social media. You can now monetize sexual content. I mean, different online platforms and digital attention, blurring the lines between public and private lives. And all of these things have made opportunities for boundary violations a lot more accessible. Your wife can receive validation and attention and sexualized interaction from strangers. They don't even have to leave the house. They will do that sitting right on the couch next to you. And if someone already is struggling with avoidant attachment or validation seeking, that can be incredibly seductive to a partner. And again, I'm not calling these partners bad or evil. Validation's powerful. And if you have had behaviors in your marriage that have really, through your insecurities and your childhood wounds, that have really driven a wedge, and if there's disconnection in the marriage, I'm not saying it's right, but it is ripe for that type of stuff to happen. And that's where the boundaries have to come in. We go back to the whole nervous system regulation because a lot of men hesitate to set boundaries because they fear either their partner being angry and they fear the blowback. They fear that it's turned around on them. So the issue doesn't become the inappropriate text. It becomes, as I said earlier, what are you doing in my phone? But a lot of men don't want to come off as controlling, because when they come off as controlling, they face wrath. And so you have to, as you set boundaries, you have to really understand that nuance between control and the boundary. If you try to control your wife, especially if your wife is a dismissive avoidant, that is going to go over like a lead balloon, because you're not going to be able to control it, and she's going to dig her heels in even more. Control, if you're saying, wife, you're not allowed to do that, you're trying to control that person. The boundary says, babe, if this happens, this crosses a line for me, and I will not participate in that dynamic. I cannot be in a marriage where this is occurring. Do you see how control, you're trying to force something, you're trying to force that behavior on your wife, where the boundary just defines what you are willing to live with, what you will accept in a marriage. Because if you try to say you're not allowed to talk to male coworkers, that's going to come off as control. It may or may not have any impact, probably none. But if you set a boundary that says, babe, if emotional intimacy with another man has developed, that crosses a line for me in this marriage. And that's not something I can accept. See the difference? One, you're forcing and you're trying to police someone. The other one, you are defining the integrity of the relationship that you're willing to be in. It's all about sexual integrity. When two people enter into a marriage, yes, there are vows, but there's also an unspoken agreement that sexual energy remains inside the relationship. Go back to the example before. Would there have been a third date if you knew that there would be sexual energy taken outside of the relationship? Probably not. But that emotional intimacy has to be protected. The couple has to protect the bond that they created. And I always say on these are good men married to good women, and if they struggle in their marriage, it's wounds and a dysfunctional pattern. But sometimes we make bad choices. But couples have to protect that bond. Couples define that in different ways. Some couples are extremely private with it. Some are very open with it socially. But the key point here is that both partners must agree on what the boundaries are. The problem begins when one person changes the rules unilaterally. When one person in the marriage decides, I want sexual attention from others. I want outside validation. I want to explore things outside the marriage. And the other partner never agreed to that. And you can see where that can be really painful. And anxious men tolerate these situations. They tolerate situations that deeply hurt them. Again, go to those sub-forums on Reddit and read one after the other, the pain. And again, it goes both ways. There are a lot of women on those forums that are in pain as well. But again, I'm talking to men right now. That anxious attachment pattern, the anxiety that men live with in their marriage, causes them to tolerate situations that are incredibly painful. And it's because the fear of losing the relationship is stronger than the fear of being disrespected. So you're going to rationalize this. You might even start telling yourself, okay, well, maybe I need to be more open-minded. I want to make something also very clear. Insecurity in a relationship, childhood wounds in a relationship, behaviors that come from anxiety, things like trying harder, these are definitely unhealthy behaviors in a relationship, but they never, ever, ever provide a green light, permission, rationale, reasonable excuse for a partner to go outside of the marriage, period. And I say that because some of these guys that I talk to, it's being spun back at them. I wouldn't have had the affair if you had done X or Y or Z. No, it doesn't work that way. You work through these things. And if the relationship is not working, you end the relationship and move on. Just to make that very, very clear, there is not a single solitary, legitimate reason of anything you have done, said, didn't do that gives somebody permission and a rationale to have sex outside the marriage or other inappropriate behaviors. Because men will start to say that, well, if I had only done this and only done this, then she wouldn't have felt like she had to go do this. She had to. No, she didn't have to. just like you don't have to. And I tell guys all the time, because this is one thing that I hear with my men's coaching that I work with. Well, maybe I should go get it outside the marriage. No, you're going to make a bad situation worse. If the relationship isn't working, you end the relationship. You heal yourself, and then you move on. Going outside of the marriage, spinning plates, it doesn't work. It does not work, especially if you've got a family at home. None of this is justification. No anxiety, no behavior is justification. I know I'm getting on my soapbox a lot on this episode, but you get what I'm saying here, because inside your nervous system is feeling the anxiety. You feel the erosion of the trust, and you're wanting to adapt. But a lot of these situations violate your values, and that slowly destroys your self-respect. So that's why you have to set boundaries. I know I'm taking a while to get to the part about the boundaries, but the boundaries that you have, because remember that attention is intoxicating to your partner. I mean, when somebody receives admiration and sexual attention from outside the marriage, it activates some very powerful neurological reward systems. Again, it doesn't mean someone intends to destroy their marriage, but it does mean that you have entered a dangerous dynamic there. When the partner inside the marriage begins to feel invisible because they feel like now the wife is looking outside, this is why boundaries matter even more. Let's say you've got a situation where your wife is sending inappropriate texts. Your wife has started texting with a male coworker. You might at first be like, I'm not going to jump to conclusions. Let me see if this is just harmless. But the more you read, the more you start to feel hurt, humiliated inside, actually. You start to feel like the intimacy of the marriage has now been compromised. You might be afraid to say something because you don't want to appear controlling, or you don't want to piss her off. You don't want to feel the blowback. But you need to just stop, breathe in. Remember, we talked about in the nervous system how to pass it through. When you see this, all of a sudden, it might build right in your chest. You breathe through, you pass it through, and then you ask yourself, what is acceptable to me in my marriage? You're the only one that can answer that. And is what I am seeing acceptable to me in my marriage? And that's where you decide to set a boundary to protect the integrity of your relationship. You have to stay calm and grounded because your nervous system is now going to be in extreme mode. And you communicate a boundary calmly, clearly. That clarity brings honesty. Babe, sexual intimacy belongs inside the marriage. I am not comfortable with these interactions that are happening with a coworker. If this continues, this is not something that is acceptable to me in my marriage. Do you see how calm and grounded that is? Do you see how that's a healthy boundary? I want our marriage to protect the emotional and sexual bond between us, and I believe this to be a threat. No accusations. I mean, you're not getting angry. You're not raging out. Just notice the tone. Notice the clarity in that. You're defining the type of marriage you're willing to be in and what is acceptable to you and not acceptable. What happens when the blowback comes? What happens when it's turned back on you? Why are you in my phone? Why are you on my email? What happens if they disagree? Because this is where things are really going to get uncomfortable, and this is where you sit in the discomfort. This is why it is so important to regulate your nervous system, because boundaries are not going to guarantee change. They're not going to guarantee compliance. Your partner may flat out disagree, may flat out turn it right around on you and say that you're the one that's being controlling. You're the one that's insecure. Boundaries are not negotiations about your core values, period. They're statements of what you are willing to participate in, what is acceptable to you in the marriage. And so you restate that boundary. I hear what you're saying, but I'm just telling you, this is not acceptable to me in the marriage. Because if two people fundamentally disagree about sexual boundaries, that's something that has to be addressed. That is going to be some tough conversations. That's where you have to be good at dealing with the conflict, or else you will get steamrollered because your nervous system will shut down. But avoiding it only delays inevitable pain. I just think about the guy who swept it under the rug. Every single day for the last 20 years, this man continues to think in his marriage about his wife having sex with This was actually a friend of his. Every single day for the last 20 years, he thinks about that, and he's still in the marriage. Avoiding it, sweeping it under the rug, all you're doing is just staying in that sense of pain, day after day, month, year. Because before you can hold those external boundaries, you've got to strengthen your internal boundaries. I've talked about that in this podcast series, how you have to have those internal boundaries. I will not betray my values to keep the peace. I'm not going to accept situations that destroy my dignity. Do you see how that inner clarity, that's going to help stabilize your nervous system too? Because when you know your values, you're not confused, you're not fearful, you know what your worth is and you know what your values are. And so you have to have those internal conversations. No, I'm not going to accept that. And if we go back through like that secure husband process where first you notice and then it's your decision to take action, it's the decision to set the boundaries. And then from there, you have that conversation with your inner child. You have that soothing of your nervous system, that divine wisdom, God, universe, whatever it is for you, you get that divine guidance, that wisdom of what is my next loving action, loving to me, loving to the situation. And so it may be having that tough conversation. That helps you stop living in confusion because that trust in the marriage, it is built through that bond. It's built through the protection that both partners have to protect it. They have to protect the sexual connection. They have to protect that emotional bond. You have to protect your dignity. Well, you both have to protect each other's dignity, but when those protections disappear and the marriage begins to feel unsafe, when that trust disappears, the connection disappears, the safety disappears, that's why boundaries are so important. They're about protection, not control, protection. You're not trying to steamroller your wife. You're just providing clarity. This is what I will and will not accept in a marriage. And from there, as I talked about in the last few podcasts, it's all gathering data. How does your wife respond to that? Does she understand that? Does she cut off the relationships? Do you guys work on repair? Or is it still being spun back on you? Then you look at it through the lens of self-respect and dignity and clarity and about what it takes to build a life of integrity for you. And it's often going to mean having those uncomfortable conversations and setting those boundaries. And you may have to set a harder boundary and a harder boundary and a harder boundary. This does not align with the type of marriage I want. That takes courage. But living without integrity is going to take a much heavier toll. This was something that I've just felt like I needed to add in here because I'm seeing it around me. I'm seeing it online. I'm seeing it with some of the guys that I am coaching. This is about values. Again, boundaries are about self-respect. They're about dignity. You may have to have these really, really tough conversations and just soothe your nervous system. You can do this. I hope this podcast was helpful for you. I know it may not necessarily apply in your situation, but it certainly applies in a few of them. And if you're new to this podcast, would you hit that subscribe button? If you're a regular listener, would you give me a review? It helps the algorithm share this with more men so they can heal. If you have questions about integrity in your relationship, I encourage you, visit securehusband.com. Fill out that form for a free 30-minute consultation, just a conversation with me, and let's see if one-on-one coaching might be right for you. And I'll see you on the next Secure Husband podcast. Thanks for listening.